let me show you an easy step-by-step bone broth recipe that takes your kitchen scraps and some common ingredients and turns them into a liquid superfood. All you need is some leftover chicken and turkey bones, a few common kitchen ingredients, and you're basically there. Bone broth is not just about saving money and reducing waste, it's about creating something delicious, nutritious, and that's good for your joints. It's loaded with protein and it's beneficial for your overall health. For the full ingredient list, check the description box below, but enough talking, let's get cooking. So for the bones of this bone broth, we're gonna use these chicken wing tips, and these are all the chicken wing tips that I've collected making all my crispy chicken wing videos. It actually paid off to buy the whole wing and trim them myself rather than start with the wingettes. So these are super high in collagen and these are super flavorful. They are great to make bone broth and they're not awesome to eat, but this is why they exist. So here I have the frozen turkey carcass from Thanksgiving. So after I parted out my turkey, I saved out the bones around the breast, and we're gonna use this plus like the neck to make this bone broth. This also is super high in collagen, very, very tasty. So we got our chicken wing tips and our turkey carcass. You can see that all of these are frozen and they've been in the freezer for quite some time, and even if they got that freezer burn on them, it's not a big deal. We're just gonna dump everything right in the pot. Now let's start adding our aromatics. So the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna trim our onion. We're gonna take off just the root end, not even much of it, just a little bit, because I find that no matter how much you clean these little roots, that they always got some dirt on them, and we don't want any dirt going in here. So I'm gonna just trim off just the tiny little roots at the bottom. So just cut it in half and take off that first layer. And if there's anything that's, any of that skin that looks dirty, we can just get rid of that. But this I'm gonna just trim up into large pieces, and we're gonna throw it right in the pot. So next we're gonna put our celery in. This is all washed and trimmed, so I'm just gonna cut it into really big pieces. And here I'll put in the end of the celery with all the leaves and everything. I'll just give it just a rough chop so everything fits in there. Now I'm gonna do the same thing with these carrots, and these are great ways to get rid of the carrots that got like extra legs and stuff. And again, I'll trim off just the tippy tops because sometimes I think they're just a little dirty and I just don't want any dirt in the broth. But then the rest of it, skin and all, I'll just cut into these really big chunks and right in the pot. And now we gotta throw in some garlic. Here I'm gonna do the same thing that I did with the onion. I'm just gonna cut off just the top of the root end of this garlic and expose all these cloves. This part I'm gonna chuck. This part's just going in there just like that. And I'll do the same for the other. So I'm just gonna cut off this top section and get rid of the roots. And now skin and all going right in the pot. I'm also gonna throw this shallot in there just because I have the shallot hanging around and starting to get a little ratty. And this is the perfect use for your vegetables that haven't gone bad yet. You're probably not gonna use them, but you can just throw them in there and it all blends in. So I'll just cut the root end off that, split that in half, and now the shallot's going right in. And even the skins that I usually throw out, we'll throw those right in. One of the things that I think adds an unbelievable flavor to bone broth is some ginger. So this ginger, peel and all, I'm just gonna cut it into big chunks. It's also going right in there. Now time for the flavor enhancers. So I got some fresh herbs in here. I got a little bit of sage, some rosemary, and some thyme. I'm gonna take all of these and I'm gonna tie them into a bundle. And tying them up is really easy. I'm just gonna tie a knot in one end and loop it. We're gonna wrap this right around the herbs. The other end goes through the loop. And then I'll just wrap it all the way around. And I don't have to go crazy. We're gonna strain this, so if anything gets in there, that's okay. We'll take the other end of that string, we'll tie it in a knot. And now this little herb bundle goes right in. Let's see if we can stick that in the bottom. Now here I got about 2 teaspoons of peppercorn, some dried oregano out of my mom's garden, a couple of bay leaves. Now we're gonna put about a half a cup of some apple cider vinegar. The apple cider vinegar helps really break down the collagen inside the bones and lets it come into the broth. And now we're gonna add a pinch of salt. We're gonna add some more salt later once we strain the broth and start to reduce it, because then we'll have a better idea of how salty it is and do we need to add a little bit more. But we're always gonna add a little bit now and a little later. Now I'm gonna fill this with water until it covers all of the stuff inside the pot. And I'm just using this quart container because I couldn't find my plastic pitcher, so I'll just have to make a couple trips to fill this up. And some of the stuff in here is frozen, so I want to see if I can just loosen up some of it to get it all down in there. That is perfect. So now we're gonna take this, we're gonna cover it up, and we're gonna put it over a low heat until it starts to boil, and then I'm gonna lower it to my lowest burner, and I'm gonna keep it there for about 48 hours. So this has been simmering super low for about 24 hours, so let's check a look at what it looks like right now. You can see that the liquid has reduced a little bit because I really filled it all the way up to the tippy top. But since I have this vent lid on this has been letting off just little bits of steam, and you can see how low of a boil that this is. It's just barely bubbling. If you got it bubbling and rocking around, it's probably way too much. You want to get this as low of a boil as possible. And you can see all of the vegetables have softened. It's giving off an amazing aroma. My entire house smells like this delicious broth. But this is going to go for another 24 hours before we strain it. So I've been letting this simmer for about 48 hours. Let's take a look and see what it looks like. So you can see we got this nice, rich brown color, and you can see how it's just barely bubbling. I just let it do this for the entire time. All of our vegetables have softened. We've lost a little bit of depth here as far as the liquid, but that's probably pretty good. I'm gonna let this off the heat. I'm gonna let it cool down a little bit just so it's a little easier to handle. And once it's cooled down, we're going to remove the solids and we'll start to strain it. So now that I've let this cool down a little bit, it's just a little easier to handle. We don't want to handle it when it's super hot. That's when accidents happen. So you can see that the fat on the top is starting to get a little solid. While it's still like this, I'm going to scrape off a little bit. We're going to remove a little bit later, but I think while this is like this, you want to just get it off while you can. My favorite fat skimming spoon is this serving spoon that's really wide and really shallow, and it makes it easier to scrape off the fat without taking in too much of the liquid. You're gonna lose a little bit, but you wanna lose as little as possible. This stuff is gold. Now, I'm just gonna skim the top and see if I can get any of that solid fat to come off. I'm not gonna go crazy because we're gonna repeat this task a little later, but if I do see any of these solid chunks starting to develop, I'm just gonna pull those right off. What you're trying to do is skim it off without disturbing it too much. You don't want to shake up the broth. And every little bit counts. Now that I've skimmed off a little bit of the fat, I'm going to use this spider to remove the solids from here. I don't have to go crazy, but I want to remove most of them to make it a little easier to transfer over the liquid. And I'm going to try to do this gently to not jar it too much. But we're gonna sort through this later, so we're gonna pick off some of that meat from the turkey carcass that I put in here. And there's that turkey carcass. We'll pick through this a little later once it has a chance to cool down a little bit more. And with each step, I'm gonna try to get as much of the liquid out as possible, because we're gonna take the liquid that even collects inside there and we're gonna put that back into the broth. No flavors left behind, and especially not with this. And there's our herb bundle. The chicken wing tips don't have much meat on them, so we're all gonna just discard that along with those vegetables. They've already done their job. And the chicken wing tips are super high in that type 2 cartilage, which makes this super joint healthy. So make sure that when you're buying your chicken wings that you're buying whole wings and trimming them yourself. Not only are they cheaper, but you get those bonus wing tips that you can use for this broth. So now that we've got most of the solids out of this broth, what we're gonna do is we're gonna take this other pot that's exactly the same, and we're gonna use this fine mesh strainer, and we're gonna pour the liquid through. If this is too heavy, you could do it just a little bit at a time with a ladle, but I'm just gonna pick this up and dump this in there. And if you don't have a second big pot like this, you could always just transfer it into a large bowl, and then once it's in the large bowl, it can go back in the pot, but this just dirties one less thing. I'm gonna take a little bit of my own advice and I'm gonna do a few ladles and lighten up this pot before we do the full dump in there. And I see a lot of these videos where people use large colanders. The holes on that are way too big and a lot of the solids are gonna go through. You gotta use a fine mesh strainer. Some people go a little further and use a cheesecloth. For me, this is okay. And I position the pots really closely to each other so we're not gonna spill anything. So once I've ladled out enough that I think that the pot's a little light and we're not gonna have any big accidents, I'm gonna pour the rest of this pot right through the strainer. Always pour it a little bit at a time. Nice and slow. You don't get extra points for doing it fast. And sometimes you might miss a little solid chunk that might fall out on the bottom, but we actually did pretty good. We're trying to get every last drop of this stock, so whatever gunk is left in here, I'm just gonna push it around to get that liquid to drip through. Especially the stuff that's collected to the solids, it has a lot of really nice flavor in it. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put this on the stove uncovered. I'm gonna bring it up to a simmer and I'm gonna reduce it just a little bit to concentrate the flavors down. I'm not gonna do it by much, maybe like 10, 20% reduction. And while that's happening, I'll then skim the fat off. So now I'm gonna get into a little labor intensive part. This is where I'm gonna pick through all of the stuff that was in the broth. I'm gonna discard the chicken wing tips and the vegetables. I'm gonna keep some of the softer vegetables to push through the strainer to really add some flavor into the broth. And any of the turkey bones that got some meat on them, I'm gonna put that aside because I'm gonna pick the meat off of those. That's a really nice chef snack that you can take, and you can just take a cup of that broth, throw some vegetables and a little bit of the meat inside of a bowl, and then you got a nice bowl of some turkey bone broth soup. So you can see that these wing tips have mushed into almost nothing. They really don't have any meat on them. It's not really worth picking through there. Any of these softer vegetables like the celery, the onions, the garlic, I'm gonna put in a bowl because we're gonna push that through the strainer. I like a lot of those flavors inside the broth. We can still capture a little bit of liquid. There's also gonna be a decent amount of liquid on the bottom of this that's gonna collect while this is all draining out. And you can see I'm just doing this with just my hands because I've let this all cool down. You know, bone broth is not something you're gonna make in an afternoon. It's gonna take a long time, but it is totally worth it. It's super delicious and it's probably one of the healthiest things that you could make in your kitchen and consume. Here are some of the turkey gizzards that were inside the little bag that I got with the turkey. These are so good and so delicious and go unbelievable inside a little soup. Here's part of that turkey neck. Nice meat on there. Wingtip, onion. Wingtip, onion. There's thigh bone, wingtips, onions, garlic cloves. Any of the onion skins you can discard. It's just the soft onions that we're after. And as I say that, I threw one of the onion skins inside here. Take that off. An herb bundle, we can, oh, wrong one. We can discard that. Here's just a big gelatinous chunk of fat. This we don't want to save. There's nothing we can really do with that. And now this part is the love that people put in cooking. Grandmas have been doing this for centuries, picking through stuff, picking meat off, doing things that just generally just take a long time. If you're in for fast recipes, this is definitely not one of them. But I also think it's important to do things that connect us to our food, slow down a little bit, and not just always value things that are quick or easy. Well, this is pretty easy. It's just not quick. This whole big piece, I'm gonna see if I can remove the skin without disturbing any of the meat. Oh. put the meat in there. Pick whatever meat we can off of this. Put that in the bowl. We can clean that up a little later. This is again just gelatinous fat. So now this bin with the chicken wing tips and the onion skins, the carrots, the herb bundle, and any other solids or some of the bones that I picked out, this we're just gonna throw in the trash. This has already done its thing. Our meat with the bones, I'm just gonna do this later where I'm gonna pick off all the little meat in there. I'll put it in a container and I'll just pick away at it, throw it in some broth and eat it like soup. The meat can be a little dry for some people, but for me it's fine and it's a nice protein and I'll gladly eat this rather than throw this in the trash. But I wouldn't serve this in a soup to others and expect them to think that it was always good. So now we're gonna take our wire strainer and we're gonna dump out the rest of the stuff. So I'm just gonna pour this through the strainer. I'll move this just around with a spoon just to get any of that liquid that's inside there. And I'll just keep moving this around until it dries up a little bit. And I'm just pushing it down. I'm not trying to mush it too hard. There's a lot of condensed flavors in there and we cannot forget those. Now let's take our onions and our garlic and the celery that's been softened and we're gonna run that through the strainer and do the same thing. This thing is gonna be loaded with liquid and flavor. And I'm just mushing down the onions, trying to squeeze out all the juice out of there until this thing turns into like a dry mush. Once this is turned nice and dry, I'm just gonna scrape the bottom of this sieve, get any of the gelatinous pieces off. So now all that liquid that collected, we're gonna run that through the strainer. Again, nothing goes into the pot without going through the strainer, because there might be little pieces that are still left over from when we use this to collect our solids. And now we'll just get out the rest of that liquid. And so now this broth is nice and strained. It just needs to reduce and we need to skim off a little of the fat. So now that this is reduced by about like 10-15%, I'm gonna skim off the rest of the fat off the top and then this bone broth is going to be good. Using that same wide spoon that I showed you before, I'm looking for any of the areas that the fat collects as it boils and you can see the different changes in the swirls here. So what I'm trying to do is remove the swirls. And I can reduce down the heat a little bit, which might make this a little bit easier. But what we're trying to do is make one nice uniform surface all the way across. So see this whole area that's right here, that's what we're gonna try to remove. And as long as we do a little bit at a time, we should be good. And that's all the fat that's collected. If you leave the fat in the bone broth, can feel a little greasy to the mouth, and that's not what you're after when you're trying to make a bone broth. And this is also one of those steps that you can't rush. You gotta take your time. If you try to do this too fast, you'll remove too much of the broth and you worked really hard to get it. So you don't want to have to end up throwing it out. Now that our bone broth has been reduced, we've skimmed off the fat. The last thing we got to do right before is to test it and see, do we need to add any salt? If you remember, we added a little salt when it was cooking. We might need to add a little bit more, but let's give it a taste. This could definitely use a pinch of salt. So it's still pretty hot, so the salt should dissolve pretty easily. So I'm just gonna go 2 pinches and then I'm gonna give it a little bit of a mix. And remember with salt, you can always add more, but you cannot take it out. And at this point, the broth is already concentrated. So that's why you wanna leave the salt for the end, because if you put too much salt in the beginning and then it reduces, it can actually be too salty. Maybe you got some health conditions where you're trying to avoid salt and keep it low in your diet, so maybe you want to make a low sodium bone broth. Let's give it another taste. Now that tastes good. Now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna ladle some of this liquid into these jars. I like to keep a couple jars in the fridge that I'll drink over the next couple days, and the rest I'll put in containers and I'll freeze for later use. So now I'm gonna put my lids on. These are just gonna go in the fridge and I'll drink these over the next couple of days. The rest of this stuff I'll freeze. But let's pour a cup right now and let's see how this tastes. And you can use this to make soups, but this is how I really like to enjoy it, is just sipping it out of a cup. This stuff is so flavorful and so good for your health. Cup of this a day, it will do you good. Now you can see that a nice rich color of this broth. Super deep, smells unbelievable. Let's take a sip and we'll see how we did. I mean, broth just tastes so good because the amount of time and attention put into it. I mean, you could make a quick broth and maybe you could do it in a pressure cooker, but it is not going to taste like this. And this was basically cheap vegetables and bone scraps. And I can't believe this tastes this good and this is this good for my health. One of the reasons this bone broth is this good is because of those chicken wing tips. So check out my chicken wing series here. This is where I make crispy chicken wings in the oven and I find out which is the best additive to make those crispy chicken wings. And I usually start with whole wings that I trim down for the tips, and that's where these tips came from. I'll see you there. Thanks.